Welcome. Hi, I'm Mark Brumley, president of Ignatius Press, and I'm here today with Robert Reilly, the author of the new book, America on Trial, A Defense of the Founding. The title of the book sounds a bit like a headline. I guarantee you we didn't choose it to be a headline. We didn't know that it would be published during a time in which the title sounded like a headline, but it's very pertinent to the headline nature of the title, and as we'll see in our discussion. Let me tell you a little bit about Robert Reilly. He's the director of the Westminster Institute. In his 25 years of government service, he's served as special assistant to the president, director of Voice of America. He's also a senior advisor for information strategy to the Secretary of Defense, and he's taught at the National Defense University. I'm giving you just the highlights, ladies and gentlemen. He attended Georgetown University and Claremont Graduate University. He's published on a wide range of topics. I think the first time I ever read an article of yours, Bob, was probably in Crisis magazine, but I may be wrong because your name is all over the place. You've written on American politics, American morality as well, foreign policy, classical music. In fact, you published a book with us called Surprised by Beauty, which perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk about in another session. Other books include Making Gay Okay, How Rationalizing Homosexual Behavior is Changing Everything, and The Closing of the Muslim Mind. So that's just a sampling of the topics our guest today has written on. And as I say, today's topic is America on Trial, his latest book. We've seen media scenes of violence, police officer with his knee on the neck of a Black American. We've seen protests, some peaceful, some violent, with fires and looting and attacks on innocent people, a series of attacks on various emblems, statues, both secular and sacred. So in many respects, we could say what's going on is America on trial. I'd like to start out by asking you, Bob, whether you think America is on trial, and if America is on trial, what are the charges? Who's the prosecution? And I'm taking it you're the defense attorney. What's your line of defense?
Well, thank you, Mark, for that generous introduction. I think America has always been on trial to some extent or another, but the trial has been particularly intense, obviously in times of war. As you may know, the book is dedicated to the memory of the uncle I never met, Major Robert R. Egan, who volunteered for World War II and lost his life. He thought America was worth defending. And I say in the book that it still is, and for the same reasons. And that is that the founding principles of the United States are good, morally good, philosophically right. Now, that's been contested. It certainly wasn't a perfect founding because we know about the presence of slavery, which the founders were almost unanimously against, and who hoped that it would eventually die out, as indeed it was on its way to dying out because the economics of slavery in the South began to diminish so greatly. But unfortunately, that was only resolved through a violent civil war. But the Union won. 13th, 14th Amendment finally brought the full promise of the equality of all men and the inalienable human rights to all Americans. So it's been a long journey. The problem now is that the prosecution is saying on the left what it always has been saying, that America is unworthy, that the new 1619 Project contends that it was born racist and has remained racist. The attacks from the left are not new. I lived through the 1960s, was very familiar with them then. Many of them are the same attacks. What is unusual are the attacks from the conservative Christian quarters, and more specifically from some Catholic Christians. Now, there the charge is a little different, but not so far as to say it doesn't share some things with the attacks from the left. It says America was a poison pill with a time-release formula, and we're its victims. That is, the American founding was based on notions of radical individual autonomy that were the principles of the Enlightenment, and that this country is a creature of the Enlightenment, and therefore was fatally compromised in its foundations, that the founding indeed was America's original sin. And we're now paying the price more fully than, say, people did in the past, because there was still that buttress of widespread Christianity. And as Christianity has receded, say these critics, the Enlightenment principles of radical individual autonomy are made more manifest. Now, we have seen statements of this individual autonomy in other quarters, most particularly in some key Supreme Court decisions, especially those written by Justice Anthony Kennedy, when he uses the term individual autonomy to say that people get to make up whatever notion of the meaning of the universe they wish to, and that homosexual so-called marriage is an exercise of that individual autonomy, which is in our Constitution, no less.
I missed that part in the Constitution. I've read it.
Yeah. So, well, it's in a penumbra, Mark. You know, it's in one of those penumbras. And our dear Catholic conservative critics say he's right. Justice Kennedy basically is right. It is there. The difference is they condemn it, whereas Justice Kennedy celebrates it. Now, my defense is they're both wrong. It's not there. Yes, there were Enlightenment influences on the founding, but not the ones they think. The founding, the Enlightenment wasn't a homogeneous thing. It had different aspects. There was the Scottish Enlightenment. The worst part of it was, of course, the French Enlightenment, which led to something very different to the American Revolution, the French Revolution. We could go into that a little later. As you know, I have a chapter in the book comparing those two things. But the book is not just a rebuttal of the accusations, saying where they get it wrong. It's more broadly an answer to the question I pose: what made the American founding, what made democratic constitutional government possible? What ideas made it conceivable in the first place? That man.
Let me interrupt. Just
sorry, that was too long. That answer was too long.
No, that's okay. So I just want to kind of summarize things a little bit. So you talked about using this trial image, critics on the right, or people on the political right who are, part of the prosecution, as it were, against America, and then people on the left, political left, who are part of the prosecution, and people on the political and theological right who are believers, and specifically who are Catholics, who are criticizing the founding. And they're criticizing the founding somewhat for different reasons, although there's some sort of deep philosophical commonality that the left thinks ought to be our self-understanding. And you gave the example of Justice Kennedy and some of his language in various decisions. And those people on the left and these critics on the right agree in saying that America is flawed at its founding, whereas the people on the left want to change it and move it in a certain direction. The people on the right just basically say it's not salvageable. We need to do something different. I'm fascinated by that. I know there are many Catholics who, and Christians more generally, who have have a criticism of the American founding, that its leaders, the founding fathers, were deists, and as you say, they were influenced by the Enlightenment, that they were nefariously influenced by the Masons and various ideas like that. That you want to go back to other sources of the founding. So I interrupted you, but I'm interested in understanding who these other sources, or what these other sources are that you think shows that the American founding is actually a good thing.
Yeah, Mark, if I just briefly comment on some of what you said, amongst the American founders, there weren't any deists. There were a few theists, but not deists. Mm-hmm. And they were overwhelmingly Christian, deeply Christian. Now, the other sources of, not the other sources, when I trace the lineage of the ideas that made the founding conceivable, we take a journey way back to ancient Israel and the revelation of the one God, to Genesis, to the announcement that this one God made everything from nothing and that everything he made was good. There's no demiurge of good and a demiurge of evil fighting it out. Everything is good. And what is especially good? Man. How do we know? Well, he's made in the image and likeness of God. Any conception of human rights today, secular, non-secular, is in some way a beneficiary of that revelation in Genesis. I would go so far as to say that Genesis is the foundation of Western civilization in that respect. That great truth of the one God, man made in the imago Dei, the goodness of creation, was revolutionary. No surrounding culture in the Middle East, all of which were polytheistic, had a comparable notion as to these very things. The other ancient lineage I point to, of course, is ancient Greece, mm-hmm. and the discovery of philosophy, what Benedict XVI called the gift of the Greeks, reason. The idea that reason can apprehend reality, that it can know the truth, it can distinguish between opinion and truth, that it discerns in that reality an order that is rational, that led the earliest philosophers we know of, the pre-Socratics, and here I particularly refer to Heraclitus, Anaximander, to wonder, how can this be? We are able, because of our reason, to apprehend this rational order. But from where did that rational order come? They speculate that it must have come from a divine intellect of which these things are an expression. And so for the first time that we know of in history, they used that Greek word logos to describe the divine intellect. Now, we also know that from ancient Greece, the notion of natural law arose, describing this rational order in nature, and ideas of justice, and the notion that what is just transcends any particular city or political order, that what is just must be just everywhere for everyone at all times. Otherwise, it's something other than justice. It's just an expression of force or power. They believed in the primacy of reason, that man ought to be ruled by his reason. And how ought the reasonable man to live? We find out by reading Aristotle's Ethics. If we know man's nature, we know that he is directed toward the good, that the only thing that can fulfill him is the good, and that he can only achieve that good, go in the direction toward it, through a life of virtue. They also thought that that life of virtue was the only foundation for happiness. So there you have, hugely significant, through the use of natural reason, all of these profound foundational truths. I next, as you know, deal with Christian revelation, that astonishing announcement at the beginning of the Gospel of St. John, which of course was written in Greek. In the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos is God. And all things were made through him. Through whom? Through Logos. Now we know why the Greeks speculated as to a divine intellect whom they called Logos, because that is how God identifies himself. He is reason in his essence. Even more profoundly, in that revelation of the incarnation, God is love. He is infinite love. He is sacrificial love. Logos enters into creation and redeems it through the sacrifice of Christ's life. Now, what does this mean? What is the significance of this for our story? It's of the most profound. Ancient man was thought of as possessing paltry significance. He was the subject of fate, a plaything of the gods. He was here today, he was gone tomorrow. He would have paltry significance all of a sudden in this blinding Christian revelation. Each individual person assumes this extraordinary worth. Why? Because each person is the object of this infinite divine love. So profound was this revelation, it became the foundation of a new civilization. And another feature of this, which has tremendous significance for the American founding and for constitutional government, is that each person's access to the divine is through Christ. Each person does have a personal relationship with God. The state is no longer the mediator of that relationship. Ancient man did not presume that he had a relationship with the divine. Only the divine or semi-divine ruler of his city or of the empire, the pharaoh. They were the only ones who had access. They were the only ones who could say those prayers that might bring an abundant harvest, or that might defeat the enemy armies. Therefore, the state, the empire, had huge significance for ancient man. He only existed within it. He had no standing outside of it. Now, in Christian revelation, he has that standing. That state, that political order has no salvific means. It is not his vehicle for achieving salvation. That's done quite outside the political order. So here we have the first teaching that has within it an inherent limitation of the state. Forever the state is diminished because of the revelation of Christianity. It can no longer presume to embody that only relationship to the divine or to some claim that it is the salvific vehicle for man.
So,
that led to the idea of limited government.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked about the Jewish contribution, the book of Genesis, and creation. Creation is good, creation by God, man made in the divine image. You've talked about the contribution of the Greeks in philosophy, the reason, and reason orienting us towards the good, and so on. And Christianity brings together those elements in the Logos, the Word, John 1:1, and that God loves each and every one of us, and that God's claim on us is absolute, and the state doesn't have the competence, as it were, to exercise that mediating role between God and the human person, which you've described as the basis for the notion of limited government. So that's a huge contribution, and we can see the connection between those elements and the founding. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to kind of summarize that for people, especially people who may have come late to the conversation.
Oh, thank you, Mark. I think that's exactly right. The other thing I would mention is that since within Christianity, each person is of inestimable worth, how we treat other human beings becomes even more significant, the respect they are owed, that their persons are inviolate. I suggested that the origin of any notion of human rights was in Genesis. Indeed it is, but you know, Judaism was a tribal religion, not a universal religion. Christianity universalized Jewish monotheism and this notion of the Imago Dei, and I'd say deepened it precisely in the ways in which we have spoken. Certainly you'd have to say that the origins of the United States were Greco-Judeo-Christian in the ways in which we've been speaking.
So this takes us probably up to 4th century, where we got Christianity, it becomes a religion of the Roman Empire. And somebody might say, well, you know, you're talking about Christianity and how the state is limited and so on. And yet, when Christians convert the Roman Empire, it becomes a Christian state. Where's this idea of limited government there? Doesn't the state seem to be taking on this mediating role again?
No. I would, you know, there's a famous doctrine called the two swords. The two swords teaching was a Christian teaching. Of course, it has its origins in Christ's famous remark, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. Well, what did that mean as it manifested itself in a political order that was Christianized to the extent to which the Roman Empire was converted? And of course, not everyone in the empire was converted. But Pope Gelasius made this clear in his letter to the Roman emperor, spelling out the two swords teaching, saying that I would not claim to instruct you in your exercise of political power because you have autonomy in that sphere. And your authority comes from God, as all authority does. And this is the nature of that authority you exercise. But I, as Christ's representative, on earth and as the head of his church have spiritual authority in the matters proper to the church. So there's an ecclesiastical sword and there is a secular sword. And those two domains are, in some sense complementary. Historically, we know they were competitive because Christianity developed this historically unique arrangement of a dual sovereignty over the same subjects. So that the person, whether it's in that late Roman Empire or in the emerging medieval Christian political order, was ruled by a secular sovereign. He was ruled by, in spiritual matters, an ecclesiastical sovereign. And those two sovereignties limited each other so that the ecclesiastical would not try to take over the political or the political the ecclesiastical. That created a wonderful, a wider space within which man could be free as he was.
In your book, you talk about medieval constitutionalism. How does that fit into these two realms, the relationship between these two realms, and the underpinnings of the American founding?
This was, I'd say, an astonishing discovery for me, Mark, as I slaved away on this book and researched and looked into some things that I had never examined so deeply before. And I'm sure it will be a surprise to many of the readers of this book, as it was a surprise to me as I was learning this, that all of the constitutional principles that we recognize today had their origins in the medieval world, and even more surprising, they had their origin in the canon law of the church at the time, as it developed from, say, the late 11th century onward. Right. What a big surprise. But it is within canon law that we see articulated the requirement of consent. Now, why would they get into issues like this in canon law after all? It's because the church created the first corporations. The notion of a corporation was uniquely Catholic and had its origin in the medieval period. How would these corporations conduct themselves? I'm speaking now of the ecclesiastical corporations, whether they were in dioceses or church councils, or whether they were in religious orders like the Dominicans. How were they to rule themselves? And the canonists pulled out a principle from the Code of Justinian, which had been rediscovered and was being closely examined, a matter that pertained only to Roman private law, that said, and I won't give the Latin, just what touches all must be approved by all, which meant in this private law, it meant the trustees of a piece of land or the trustees of a minor child or something, for the disposition of that land, all the trustees had to agree, which had probably 2 or 3 trustees. They had to agree.
We'd probably use the expressions of stakeholders.
Stakeholders, yes. And surprisingly, the canonists in the Middle Ages took this private law and expanded it into a public principle. And it was expressed explicitly in church councils, repeated by popes, adopted by religious orders, that what touches all must be approved by all. What did that mean? It meant, and to go directly to the relationship with the American founding, it meant no taxation without representation, because many of the most contentious matters that arose had to do with funds for the church, for education, for the diocese, for the consistories, etc. And that money, that taxation, that could not be appropriated without the consents of the people from whom it was appropriated. That's what the principle meant. But it extended to other things as well. And let's give a little example from the Dominican order and its conduct by both St. Dominic and for those his successors. They would have the meetings of all the chapters, Dominican chapters, in which they had to decide a number of things. How was this going to be done? Well, St. Dominic said each chapter should elect a representative because the matters must be approved by all or by at least a majority of all, because what is decided will affect everyone. So each of the Dominican chapters would elect a representative, and the representative was invested with the authority to vote on these issues for them, and they would be bound by that. And so such decisions would take place, and St. Dominic and his successors themselves said, this is sovereign. What is decided by these meetings, it applies to us all. We must all be subject to it. So you had, let's say, it was the rule of law, but the law was formed through the consent of those to whom the law applied, and it applied to everyone.
So we have there, the beginnings in the Western society, the beginnings of the idea of consent of the governed, and in a context in which we have representation. So you've got consent and you've got representation. A lot of people will think of the Middle Ages, though, as they think of the ages of kings, and sometimes they will think of the notion of kingship as involving the divine right of kings. And you talk about that in the book in some depth, and you clear up misconceptions people have sometimes in thinking that somehow the divine right of kings is a Catholic notion. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was alien to Catholic thought, and it was completely alien to the Middle Ages. Let me more generally address the rest of the constitutional issues.
Sure.
That were broadly taught and accepted in the Middle Ages by its greatest philosophers and theologians, including Thomas Aquinas. God, of course, is sovereign. All authority comes from God. But in whom does God invest this authority on earth when it comes to political rule? Does God invest it directly in the king? In which case we have the divine right of kings? Or does God invest it in the people through whose consent a king is created, or a republic is created, or whatever other forms of government may be legitimately consented to? And the answer was, popular sovereignty is invested in the people. That is why their consent is required in their rule, which, by the way, is the rule of reason, because all people are free and equal and invested with reason. And they're to live by their reason, which means by those moral rules.
So that's a kind of natural equality. They're all human beings.
Yes, there's a natural equality. Thomas Aquinas made that famous statement about sin. What is sin? It's doing what is unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
The great Catholic teaching is behaving reasonably, is behaving morally. And so this was a broadly accepted notion within that medieval Christian world. So you had equality, popular sovereignty, the requirement of consent, the right to representation so that consent may be expressed. And the other thing that you had that was universally accepted was the right to revolution. Should the king not keep his compact with the people, should the ruler rule tyrannically, he may be deposed.
So the idea there is the king has he has authority from God, but not directly. He has it through the consent of the people, and he has his authority not to benefit himself, but to benefit the people.
Yes.
And when he acts in a sustained way or a serious way against the good of the people, from whom he has authority and for whom he is to exercise authority, the people have a right to alter or abolish that government.
Exactly. The king has his power from the people provisionally insofar as and so long as he keeps his compact with the people or his covenant with the people. That was the teaching in the Middle Ages, and the notion of the divine right of kings or an absolute political sovereign was totally alien to it.
All right. Well, so then how do we get from there to the American founding? You've done a good job of giving us sort of foundational principles and ideas. How do we get, so we're talking about now, we're in the 16th century or thereabouts, and we go from there to the 18th century and the American founding in North America. How do we get from there to there?
Well, I think, Mark, the question quite reasonably is, why didn't we just go from there to there? I mean, why was there an American founding necessary in the first place? Why didn't the logical development of these constitutional principles continue?
Very good.
They didn't continue. There was there was a loss of them, in fact, a denial of their legitimacy. Now, as you know, in the book, I talk about the effect of the Reformation, more specifically about Luther.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not to peg this problem on a Protestant, because it has its origin in another Catholic priest, William of Ockham. So we're dealing now with the late Middle Ages, when William of Ockham changes the theological understanding of God that was prevalent in the Middle Ages, and who, let us say, severs the long-standing relationship between the Christian understanding of God and Aristotelianism. It was a revolt against the Aristotelian influence on the church, which was so superbly expressed in the thought of Thomas Aquinas.
So Aristotelianism, meaning the philosophy of Aristotle, which St. Thomas in the 13th century helps to recover and apply in a consistently Christian way.
Yes, and that preserves and further develops and explains what is this natural law, what is this rule of reason. Now, Occam and thinkers like him said, no. The thing about God's essence, on which we must emphasize, is that he is pure will and power. He is not constrained by this thing called reason. Not only he's not constrained by any laws of nature. There are no such laws. There can't be any laws of nature if there's no nature. And that's basically what Occam says. He was what you call a voluntarist. That's the technical theological term for someone who believes that God's essence is pure will and power. By saying this, he flipped the relationship that St. Thomas had insisted upon, that in God, the divine intellect rules, reason rules, and the will follows.
God wills according to his reason and consistent with his nature.
Right. Thank you. Because why? Because he's Logos. Occam flips that relationship and says, no. God's will rules and reason follows in some instrumental way, So it's the will. And now what happens when the will becomes primary in the way in which Occam made it? Creation loses its intelligibility because it's no longer invested with these laws of nature, which made it apprehensible. Everything is thought to be just the direct expression of God's will, and God can change his will at any moment. There's no law of nature that can prevent him. There's no sort of internal consistency within God that prevents him from just flipping everything over. As Occam infamously said, God could require us to hate him.
Right.
And we'd have to do it. This, of course, is an absurdity to a Thomist or any conventional medieval Christian thinker. Now, the problem is with Luther, as far as the American founding goes, is not that Luther was a Protestant, is that he was a voluntarist, an anomalist. And what did that lead to in Luther's thought? It led him to a denigration of Aristotle that is truly surprising. I mean, if you read what he says, which is, I put it in the book, it's a shocker. He denigrates Thomas Aquinas as well. He says the worst book ever written is the Ethics, that he would have thought that Aristotle was the devil if it wasn't known he was a human being, that it's Aristotelian thought that made true theological thinking impossible, let me be more specific about the problems this led him to in the very constitutional principles we laid out. Luther denied popular sovereignty. The people are not sovereign. He denied the requirement of consent. The people's consent is not required in their rule. Therefore, they have no right to representation. And you won't be surprised that Luther denies the right to revolution against tyranny. Poof. There it goes. Now, Luther said many things, and I do understand after 1630, he modified his views on the right to revolution. But also, this is the other problem. Luther, of course, had his doctrine of sola scriptura, scripture alone, sola fide, faith alone, sola gratia, grace alone. He denied and burnt in public the canon law of the church. He basically destroyed the corporation of the church. By destroying the institutional church, Luther took away one of the two swords. He did that, and that was the practical effect of what he did. He still believed there was a spiritual sovereignty. The only problem now is that it didn't have a church through which to express itself that had any independence of the state. Luther turned to the prince to reform the church. And as you know, as a result of the Lutheran Reformation, the princes became, the heads of the church in their respective kingdoms or dukedoms, etc. So this empowered the prince. The prince now, this allowed the development of the doctrine of the divine right of kings. There was nothing in its way. And we saw that divine right of kings developed and articulated in James I in England, and in the greatest defender and expositor of the divine right of kings, Sir Robert Filmer, in his famous book, Patriarcha. The king was appointed directly by God. He was not accountable to his people. The king made the law, but the king was above the law. There was no right to revolution, of course.
Right. So we're, Bob,
okay.
I don't want to interrupt you because this is so rich. And I said before we got started, it was dangerous for me to be interviewing you because I could go on for hours with this. But I want to push you on this point, partly in the interest of time, but also just so that people can see the connections here better. How do we get to this, to the American Revolution? And why is it that the critics of America's founding, and we'll talk mainly about the Catholic critics now, why is it the critics of the American founding who see the American founding as a poison pill that, time release, as you said, all the bad things that we have today are simply the working out of the poison of that pill over time? Why is it they're wrong, especially in light of what you've told us thus far?
Well, I don't know how much time we have left, Mark, so I'll just try to compress things and jump ahead. As you know, there was a English Revolution against the Stuart monarchy, and over the years, it was Parliament that became the supreme institution in British life. Now, the American colonies, most had royal charters. They ruled themselves to almost a complete extent for around 150 years when they became quite habituated to self-rule. They taxed themselves, etc. But they thought of themselves as Englishmen and as enjoying the rights of Englishmen. It's when Parliament tried to exercise absolute power over the colonies that the colonists began to think, what we're going to say, no, we have the same rights as Englishmen, and you cannot tax us without our consent. Famously, no taxation without representation. In fact, they quoted exactly in Latin the principle of first from the Justinian Code and then in church canon law, and then more broadly in the early parliaments. What affects all must be consented to by all. They thought that this was the definition of tyranny, and as such, they had a right to revolution. They knew they had to articulate that right in a more philosophical, universal way than simply saying we've been denied the rights of Englishmen, because those were precisely the rights that Englishmen would not recognize them as having. Thus, the preamble in the Declaration of Independence, that under the laws of nature and of nature's God, all men are invested by their creator with certain inalienable rights, right? Life, liberty, etc. And since they were being ruled without their consent, and there's a long list, as you know, of grievances in the Declaration of Independence, they call upon under divine providence and with God as their supreme judge, the right to revolution, and therefore they declare their independence. Now, what this clearly is a revolution against state absolutism and a return to the medieval constitutional principles that had been violated. The founding was a restoration of the primacy of reason as against the primacy of will, as it had been expressed in the British Parliament, that said that we have the power to rule you in all cases whatsoever without your consent. That's what led ultimately to the American Revolution. As you know, the American founding, as it developed constitutionally in 1787, came up with a unique form of limited government, a unique form of dual sovereignty. People were ruled by two governments, a federal government and their state government. The state, at least the federal government to begin with, was to have no power, no spiritual powers or claims. It was a Christian founding, very much so, in the extent that this government was limited, that this very Christian founding did not look to government as a salvific means. They looked to Christ and their churches for those means. The government was not to trample in that territory. As you know, the Constitution was dated in the year of our Lord. The Constitution contains a provision that exempts Sunday from the 10 days in which a law must be signed by the president or automatically become law. It was a Christian nation. I contrast that, Mark, with the French Revolution, which was premised upon, or at least in its most radical expression, which is what I talk about, because the Jacobins, after all, took over the French Revolution, was based on the premise of the perfectibility of man here, now, in this world. And we would obtain the means through power to perfect man ourselves. And the principal obstacle to that project of self-perfection is, guess what? It's Christianity. It's the church. Therefore, it must be destroyed. Therefore, the French Revolution went about a thorough de-Christianization campaign in France, shutting down the religious orders, expelling the priests and nuns, executing a number of them, taking the crosses off of graveyards, off of steeples, turning churches into temples of reason, etc. All we have to do is ask ourselves, can you imagine during the American Revolution there being a de-Christianization campaign in the American colonies or the early United States? There would never have been. Tocqueville later gives the answer. He said, in Europe, we've always had this incompatibility between faith and reason, or at least in, a modern Europe. But in the United States, we find that they're compatible. In fact, you hardly talk about one without talking about the other. So this reconciliation of faith and reason, which had again been a tremendous feature of the Middle Ages, was achieved in the United States.
So let me ask a question about this, and this is partly related to what some of the critics say. In the 19th century, there is within Catholic circles, especially in the Vatican, various things, going back Pius IX, various things, early Pius IX was a little bit more sympathetic, but over time, Pius IX, the Pope, makes statements that come across as very anti-democratic. we'll say. At least they're interpreted that way. And I think it's fair to say that there are a number of theoreticians in the church at the time, reflecting on papal teaching and other things, who are cool to the idea of democracy, at least in the sense of universal suffrage or more general suffrage and participatory government and things of that sort. Benedict XVI talks a little bit about this when he reflects on the development of doctrine and the development of the notion of religious liberty, where he says the church was often looking at these things through the eyes of the French Revolution. And it took a while for the church to understand, well, there was another revolution, the American Revolution, and that was not a revolution that was antithetical to faith, but was actually compatible, that there was a close conveniency, as the medievals would say, between faith and reason. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and of course, Benedict XVI isn't the only one who said that. John Paul II said it in a very powerful and eloquent way. Now, I think you're right to point out that in certain respects, the church was a latecomer to democratic constitutional rule. And some of the reasons are historical because of what's called the marriage of cross and crown, that the church became identified with the rule of kings, that it became just about as dependent upon a Catholic monarch as the Protestant Lutheran churches were upon the prince, their princes or their kings. And the reason this happened is exactly because of the Reformation. Those places which remained Catholic had to do with the suffrage of a Catholic prince or Catholic king. They became dependent upon the royal rule. And certain Catholic monarchs, one thinks of Louis XIV, were only too happy to have their own version of the divine right of kings. So it's that's mixed. But I think we need to talk of the American experience in the church. And that brings us to John Carroll, who was a member of the most famous one of the most famous families, certainly the most famous Catholic family in the colonies in Maryland. His cousin, Charles Carroll, was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence and was possibly the wealthiest man in the colonies, and who put his fortune at the disposal of the American Revolution and, of course, his life. John Carroll, as a priest, went with Benjamin Franklin to Canada to try to elicit Canadian support, indeed even participation in the revolution against the British. That failed. But John Carroll wrote to the Vatican after the American Revolution a very moving letter saying this is the best news the church has ever had in the American colonies, because we are to be afforded the greatest religious liberty. And we owe, therefore, to this political order our allegiance. He became, of course, the first bishop, and he continued to express his admiration for the American founding and its principles. There's a very funny exchange when a letter goes from Bishop Carroll to Jefferson asking if it would present any problems if a French bishop was appointed down in the Louisiana area. And he's answered by the Secretary of State, who was Madison, I think, at the time, who said, the president is very grateful for your kind letter and expression, but please understand, we would not think it proper to express ourselves on this matter because we have no authority or jurisdiction. This is entirely your decision of your church.
Yeah, that question, of course, comes out of a context where the expectation of church leaders is that the political authority will have an interest or a say in who gets appointed where. And then in the American Republic, it was made clear that this was outside their jurisdiction. They didn't have a right to say or an authority to say.
Yeah, it's a restitution of the two swords teaching.
Right. Well, this is fascinating. Wish we had more time to go into this. Maybe we'll follow this up with a subsequent discussion of the topic, because there's so much more in your book, America on Trial. I got to hold up the book, Bob. America on Trial, A Defense of the Founding. We've given people a tremendously rich background to begin. There you go. To begin to understand the American founding and this notion that you have of America's founding, not as a revolution in the sense of a wholly radical break from the past. Sometimes language about America establishing a new order and all of that can give the impression that this is a wholly radical break from everything that's preceded. But you've done a great job of helping us understand the sense in which we can see that at the core of the American founding there is this notion of a restoration of this rich heritage that we have in the West with respect to things such as popular sovereignty, representative government, limited government, and constitutionalism. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time with us to talk about this. Here we are almost at the vigil of Independence Day. I think it's great for our viewers, our listeners, to reflect on what you said, to go out and get a copy of your book, and to begin reading so that we can make fully our own the rich heritage that we have as Americans. So I want to thank you very much for being with us.
Wonderful, Mark. Thank you so much. God bless you.